who's on the roundtable. And thanks so much for joining us today. It's great to have so many people on the line for this important discussion. My name is Bill Wasserman. I'm a partner here at M&R. And I've had the privilege over the last 5 years to work with the Vera Institute of Justice on the effort to lift the ban on Pell Grants for incarcerated students, which we'll be talking about over the next hour. I've been at M&R for over 25 years, and over that time, we've had the chance to work on campaigns on a wide range of issues, from tobacco control to climate change to efforts to raise the minimum wage. And the campaign to lift the Pell ban included many of the strategies and lessons learned from those campaigns and combined what we consider a blend of pressure and persuasion tactics to achieve our goal. At M&R, we work with nonprofits and foundations that are fighting to make the world a better place. We work with our clients across a range of services, from earned and social media to advertising, digital organizing, and fundraising. But we also strive to create space for our peers in the progressive and nonprofit and philanthropic communities to come together and share best practices, celebrate wins, both big and small, and learn from one another. And that's really what these roundtables are all about, the opportunity to learn. Today, we want to dig into and share more details about the learnings with you about the multi-year campaign to lift the ban on Pell Grants for incarcerated students. Last December, as part of the end of the year spending bill, Congress voted to end the 26-year-old ban that prevented people in prison from accessing Pell Grants to advance their education while incarcerated. What makes this victory important is first and foremost its impact on incarcerated students and their families. We know that access to education while incarcerated ensures that people return home poised to succeed with lower rates of recidivism and increased opportunity for themselves and their family. But the victory is also important because we moved it through Congress with bipartisan support. And while there are many pathways to win on issues, executive orders often at the top of the list, passing a legislation or provision through Congress makes that change lasting. So we know that the Pell reinstatement won't be subject to the whims of a future president, and ensuring bipartisan support is critical to protecting your issue from future challenges. We also want to discuss how we went about building a campaign that achieved this kind of support and moved through Congress during a period of unprecedented partisan gridlock. I'll be discussing with the participants today about how we built the campaign, how we worked to center stories and expertise and impacted students and their families, and how we integrated a nimble grass-tops earned social media campaign that positioned us well for victory. So joining me today are Margaret diZerega from the Vera Institute of Justice, Terrell Blount from the formerly incarcerated College Graduates Network, and Ben McMakin from Crossroads Strategies. Margaret leads the Vera's Center on Sentencing and Corrections, and she'll provide us with an overview of the Pell ban and explain why lifting the ban was so urgently needed. We'll then hear from Terrell, who worked with Margaret at Vera and is now a program officer at the Laughing Gulf Foundation, working with in higher education prison programs. He also leads the formerly incarcerated College Graduates Network. Terrell is going to speak about the impact of Pell restoration on incarcerated students and their families, and the role that people impacted by the justice system have played in sharing their personal experience. And we'll discuss our federal and grass tops advocacy strategies with Ben. So we'll hear first from Margaret and Terrell and Ben, and then we'll have some additional conversation about the campaign. And we're also planning to hold at least 10 or 15 minutes at the end for your questions. So please drop any questions you have throughout the discussion into the chat. With that, I'll turn it over to Margaret to share more about the background of the Pell campaign.
Great, thank you, Bill. And thank you all for joining today's discussion. Looks like we have a lot of communicators based on the poll results. So I'm Margaret diZerega from the Vera Institute of Justice, and just to kind of ground our conversation a little bit, I want to talk about what the impact was of the 1994 crime bill, which removed Pell Grant eligibility for people in state and federal prison. As many of you may know, Pell Grants are available to people who meet the income qualifications and can use them to go pursue their college education. And if I get a Pell Grant, it does not mean that you cannot get a Pell Grant. So anyone who meets the eligibility criteria, has that opportunity available to them. We saw that there were, a couple hundred college and prison programs before the 94 crime bill, and once it was put into place, those programs kind of dried up overnight. There were a few that were able to maintain momentum through state contract dollars or private foundation dollars, but it was no longer common for people in prison to have access to college. So fast forward to 2012, which is when the Vera Institute of Justice got involved in this issue. And so that's my starting point, frame of reference. And we were fortunate to work on a project called Pathways from Prison to Post-Secondary Education, where we were able to work in 3 states to help them expand their college and prison programs, and try to spur some national discussion about whether the ban could be lifted through congressional action. It became clear that that was not going to happen. And so in 2015, under the Obama administration, the Department of Education launched a pilot program called Second Chance Pell. And this used an experimental sites authority that the Department of Education has, where it can test the use of Pell Grants in different environments. And so the department initially selected 67 colleges who were allowed to administer Pell Grants to serve students in prison for the first time since 1994. And we have been the designated technical assistance provider to all those college programs and their corrections partners. So that includes state corrections departments and Bureau of Prisons. And then under the Trump administration, the program was actually doubled. And so what's significant about that is not only was it a clear piece of evidence of bipartisan support for college and prison and the use of Pell Grants to fund that, but it also meant that we now get to work with 130 colleges across 42 states and DC. And so that network, that really rich network of college prison partnerships is one that we were able to draw on and really leverage for the campaign that we're going to talk about today. 2 other things I just want to mention briefly, a little bit about the campaign goal. So when we started the campaign, it was right after Trump had been elected. And to be candid, we were not sure what the fate of Second Chance Pell was going to be in his first 100 days. And so we decided to start by really focusing on states. Many states have barriers to financial aid for incarcerated students that sort of mimic the Pell ban and were put in place mostly following the 2008 recession. So we decided to start by building change at the state level, and we succeeded in helping states pass legislation to remove barriers to college and prison in 5 different places. We had an intentional focus on strategic communications and really driving narrative change on this issue. And then the goal was really that lawmakers would have the political will to support expansion of access at the state and then ultimately the federal level. So that was a little bit of kind of the architecture of how we got started. And the research on this is really clear. Not only is education transformative, period, but we know that for every dollar invested in education, the RAND Corporation published a study talking about sort of the $5 of return on investment. and the recidivism rates significantly drop for people who are involved in post-secondary education in prison. So this is, for us, really about creating pathways to opportunity. It's about equity and access to education, and it's about safety, both outside prisons, but also inside prisons, because where these programs exist, there are many fewer incidents, and so it's safer for the people who are incarcerated as well as the staff who work there.
Thanks, Margaret. And I know we'll have a lot more to dig into, but first let's hear from Terrell Blount with the formerly incarcerated college graduates network. And Terrell, if you could share a little bit of your perspective on the impact of lifting the Pell ban.
Well, I appreciate first and foremost being a part of this discussion, Bill. I do believe that the impact of lifting the bill, I think no one would argue that it was a momentum. It really shifted the momentum in how we approach higher ed in prison, because as Margaret pointed out, especially post 1994, there weren't that many college or prison programs or higher ed and prison programs that had their own funding, or had lots of funding from foundations or government grants. It just didn't exist. So now with Pell Grants being restored, once they are accessible and students officially begin to draw down on those dollars, we're talking about lives being changed. We're talking about families, the trajectories of families and children of loved ones who are incarcerated being changed. And a close friend who's also formerly incarcerated and lives in New York, right across the bridge or under the tunnel, since I'm over in Jersey. He said to me one time when we were just out and hanging, right? He said, "Yo, your son's life is going to be very much different than yours is. And it's all because you took this opportunity to change your life around." And I wasn't arguing with them at all, because I always say, my children are gonna have it better than I did. And that it's highly possible that wouldn't be the case if I did not pursue a higher education. And when we say that, we point out the fact that higher ed attainment, leads to all of these things. People who oppose it, they don't really see or understand what we mean, right? So yes, being in college and achieving a college degree can boost your chances of employment, right? But the things that got me to where I am today is the connections that I've been able to make because I was enrolled as a college student. So making those connections with my professors, having jobs on campus where now my previous employers, I'm creating an employment history simply because I'm a college student. They don't have you fill out, or they didn't have me fill out at that time, job applications where I'm being asked a question. I have a student ID from Rutgers. I can go and work at the cafeteria. And I did that for 5 years. And also worked my way up where I became a manager. And now when it's time for me to graduate and go out into the real world, I now have references that I can, go back to. So yes, the education piece absolutely increased my knowledge on multiple, areas. It's classes that I've taken that I wouldn't have, had I not gone to college, I wouldn't have ever picked up some of those books. But it's the connections that I was able to make from being immersed in a college environment, and to now have Pell Grants reinstated to people in prison. They're making those connections much earlier because I am not a recipient of a higher education in prison program in the way that it is now. So students in there being able to come home with an associate degree, coming home with credits, transcripts, and being able to continue their education, it's a game changer for everyone involved.
Thanks a lot. That's so powerful, Terrell. Ben, can you tell us a little bit about the campaign to lift the Pell ban and how it maybe differed from other advocacy campaigns you've been involved in?
Sure. Let me quickly say thanks, Bill and M&R, for having me today. It's been great working with you guys as partners in the Vera team, and I especially want to thank Margaret and Hayne and George and the team at Vera for bringing us on. You know, I've been in DC for 25 years, trying not to date myself here, but I would say that this effort was one of the most meaningful things that I've been party to, and I know I'm going to feel that way watching, you know, what comes next for all of these young folks going forward. But for us, you know, we were brought on the team in March of 2019, and I would think at that time, none of us were quite sure that we would be able to win this thing in 2020, a mere, let's just say 18 months later. And we did. And I think where we fit into all of this, and so much was done before we came on board. You had the ins and the outs already working. You had a great coalition on the outside, in addition to Vera. But I think what my colleague Matt and I did was really two things. And the first is what all lobbyists do, is work to build support for your initiative. And we certainly helped that outreach, both with Democrats and Republicans. But the second thing I think we did that was, I think, added the most value is Matt and I were able at a member and senior staff level to really talk to the decision makers about where this issue stood, what the barriers to go forward were, who needed a little help, and how to take that senior level data and input about the process and feed it back into the coordinated effort led by Margaret and her team. And so I really think being able to do that in a bipartisan fashion at a very high level ultimately created a lot of really helpful information that propelled the cause forward.
Great. Thanks, Ben. So I have a handful of questions to sort of guide our discussion that I want to talk through, but I will reserve time for people to ask questions from who are part of the roundtable, part of our discussion in the webinars. So please put your questions in the chat. Let's start by just sort of backing up a little bit, and I think there's a question for you to start with, Margaret. Were there efforts before we got started on this campaign in, say, 2016, 2017, were there prior efforts to lift the Pell ban?
Yes, I mean, you know, Ben referenced the really strong coalition that we were fortunate to get to work alongside. And I think it's because a lot of the efforts that had preceded this, you know, these last couple of years that we all collectively were successful. So one of the really concrete things was the REAL Act. And it was something that Senator Schatz from Hawaii had introduced a few different Congresses. And the idea with the REAL Act is to just strike the ban for people in state and federal prison as far as accessing Pell Grants. That's the only thing it does. It is very clean and simple. And it proved to be a very useful organizing tool because even when it wasn't clear that there was a path through Congress, through, you know, potentially the Higher Education Act reauthorization, or certainly before anyone was thinking about appropriations, the REAL Act was something that you could take to member offices to talk about with them. There was a clear ask to be made, and it was a way to get people on the record saying they were in support of restoring Pell eligibility for all people in prison, regardless of conviction. And I, you know, based on what I'm seeing of who's here on the call today, many of you are knowledgeable about justice issues. It is virtually unheard of that you could have a win that includes everybody and does not leave anyone behind. And I think the REAL Act played an important role in building some of that momentum. And then that was something that ultimately, you know, we see reflected in the final legislation.
So apart from obvious challenges like the uncertainty and not being sure what the Trump administration was going to do around the issue in Second Chance Pell, I'd love to talk a little bit about some of the early challenges in building this campaign and how the campaign planned to get ahead of those challenges. Like, what do you feel were the most difficult challenges in the earlier days? And maybe Terrell, you or Margaret, either of you could weigh in on that.
Well, I know for me, I think slightly geared toward what Margaret was sharing is I remember there just being a challenge of coming to a common ground, an agreement, or understanding of like what are our values as a group of folks from different organizations working toward a common cause. What are our values, and what are we willing to not budge on or stay firm in? Something that we're not going to give up or negotiate. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't give any indication toward the groups not being able to work together. I think you see that in every group of people that are fighting for something, because from my experiences and organizing in the streets, whether I'm doing advocacy work or protesting, when you're with a group of folks and we talk about the route that we're going to march down, and we talk about the possibility of police come, you have a group or you have some people within that group that will run the moment they see police. You have the rest of the group will keep going. You have a group that will stop or start to retreat once they see police walking towards you with shields. They'll drop off, and you still have a group that will keep going. Once they start throwing tear gas, you have another group of people that are going to fall off. And that's because there is no common understanding going into it. What are we, because we don't need people to break off the chain. And I think in this movement in particular, we, as Margaret mentioned, we want to see it restored to all people, right? I'm not going to march. I don't want to be in a situation where I'm marching with you. And then the moment they say, we'll restore Pell, but not to this particular group. And you say, let's take it. Let's just take it. Don't whisper and tell me, let's just take the deal. I want this to go and be restored to any and everybody who is eligible to participate, because that's what justice is. And I'm not in the business of negotiating justice. This isn't a bargaining table where we go and come back and discuss this. No, this is what's right, and it's what I believe in. And again, that's a challenge that across the board, when you're fighting with a group of people and fighting for the same thing, there are some levels at which people would drop off. But I think the organizations that were involved in this and kept collaborating, till the end, and even those that may have separated and still promoted stories or did whatever communication efforts that they had to push the message. I think folks really rallied around this issue of Pell restoration, which I think at the foundation of it is the most important piece. But making sure that Pell Grants did not leave out anyone out of this movement. I think early on it was a challenge to get everyone on the same page with that.
Yeah, such a powerful point, Terrell. I'll just jump in with something. I know that in 2020, especially when the pandemic began, we worried that we would lose support from the business community, because one of our powerful arguments was we need people prepared for the jobs that exist. And we had, when the majority of this campaign, it was in a period of very low unemployment, but really that wasn't the case in the end. And that wasn't a challenge. And in fact, some of our allies in the business community stuck with us to the very end. And so I think that base we had helped us overcome that challenge. I don't know, Ben, Margaret, do you think about other challenges that we had to face that you want to mention?
I think it's really important what you're just walking through, because even recall a year prior, the First Step Act, the Trump administration's attempt to be helpful, there were conditions and restrictions in that legislation. So, I think there was a lot of angst about whether we would be able to get to, a full restoration with no restrictions at all. And the progress that the campaign made over the last year in particular, really led by, the outside groups were much further along than many in Congress, particularly on the Republican side. But we worried about that for a long, long time. And in the end, I think in part, the story Terrell tells and the community was so far along that Congress didn't have a choice but to follow. A number of things went into that, of course, but the path to no restrictions was really cleared by, the advocacy over the last year, and the differentiation between what was done in the First Step Act and ultimately what was done for Pell. It just shows you how much further the campaign got.
So, Margaret, you mentioned earlier that towards the end of the Obama administration, the experimental sites initiative began, Second Chance Pell. Can you tell us how important was that and for our work in the campaign? What role did it play?
Sure. I mean, I think it's hard to imagine we would have gotten here without Second Chance Pell as quickly. And I think, so, the initial set of colleges were selected in summer of 2016. So we didn't have a lot of time with the Obama administration once they were announced. And then we held our breath for the first 100 days of the Trump administration, like really hoping this was not going to be on the first 100 days, like chopping block with the new administration. And so once it was clear that it wasn't, and that in fact justice reform was going to be a real point of emphasis for the Trump administration, as evidenced by the First Step Act, and all the positive press around that. Some of you may remember Kim Kardashian going to the White House. Like, there was a lot of buzz around justice reform. And so for the administration to have Second Chance Pell operating, I think was really helpful. We went with Secretary DeVos to a graduation in Oklahoma, and she really valued that experience. And from what I gather, that had a role to play in the decision for the Department of Education to double the pilot program. And so what it meant was during, we organized 3 different Hill days over the course of the campaign, and something that we had never done before at Vera. And it was amazing to be able to have, a team from a given jurisdiction, a formerly incarcerated student, a college faculty member, and a corrections administrator, sitting down with a member of Congress or their staff and talking about what was happening in their state. And usually that office was not aware of the program, or that like this particular college in their district was teaching in prison. And so it just brought the whole thing to life. And to have these 3 very, expert speakers in front of them, I think also really humanized the issue. And, we all have borrowed from Brian Stevenson heavily in talking about the value of proximity. And this was one way we could get those offices proximate to this issue, in addition to, the colleges and corrections departments inviting them to graduations when in-person ceremonies were happening. And so it was really valuable, I think, to have those opportunities to just make the clear connection that this is an issue that matters in your state. It matters from a safety perspective. It matters from an employment perspective, and just, human dignity perspective as well.
So you mentioned the role that students played in that, and formerly incarcerated students in particular, in that advocacy, and that's often a big piece of successful campaigns in my mind, bringing people with lived experience. Terrell, can you share, is it difficult to get to engage students? I know that's the goal of your network, of the College Graduates Network, but to to engage students and families. How did you go about doing that, and how have you built the network in a way that people want to participate in this kind of advocacy?
Well, I would first say that the network that Bill is referring to is the formerly incarcerated college graduates network, which I'm the director of. And to your question about engagement with like members and any challenges, I wouldn't say that there's challenges in seeking, support from folks. I did a huge campaign around promoting the work that FICGM was doing alongside the Drug Policy Alliance, College Community and Fellowship primarily, just organizing, like virtual Hill visits and phone calls to speak with staffers about like the importance of restoration, especially with no exclusions. And that campaign included me first and foremost learning how to use Canva and create flyers and doing like posting and stuff like that. But just creating different times where folks could chime in, meet with me. I would, if they were looking to volunteer, because I wanted to be particular and explicit in saying that you would be sharing some type of part of your experience in a higher ed prison. And then once I would talk to folks, sometimes it was in a group setting if that worked, other times it was one-on-one, but I would explain to them, going into this, you shouldn't feel obligated to share like the ins and outs of your particular like offense or your conviction. And sometimes I would explain, like sometimes, the person would be sitting there intrigued that, the person in front of them served 15 years and now they're, a graduate from this prestigious university. And they might ask like, out of curiosity, which is human nature, what were you convicted on? But it was having those conversations with them to say, listen, I don't know how open you are with, sharing what you've gone through or anything about your conviction history. But if you choose to, this is a way you can talk about it. Because one thing I don't want to do is silence anyone and tell them that, you shouldn't ever talk about what happened. I wouldn't get graphic with anything at all. But, if you wish to tell them what your offense was or whatever the case, that's completely up to you. Just know that you have agency over sharing your story. And that's the message that we would share, on those calls leading into it. And everyone performed, exceptionally well. And sometimes very last minute, it would be on the fly where, the day before, I would go into our database and select for who's from Missouri and then email everyone and say, hey, I got a call tomorrow at 4 p.m. Can anybody make it? And they would just email me back and say, hey, Terrell, people I never met before, because I don't know everyone in the network, but people I never met before would email me, an hour later saying, hey, I'm game, just let me know. And it's that type of commitment to this work. And it just shows the dedication that folks have, that a lot of the times when they were on the calls, it's not like they were injustice related positions. It wasn't like, people were joining from working at a community organization. No, this guy is like a doctor. And, and I mean doctor meaning like he has his PhD and is teaching on campus, but he's on the call, fighting for people to get Pell Grants, or this person works on a farm and they're on the call talking about like what they learned through college. And it was just something that really stood out to me, because I think it would be a no-brainer to say, oh, this person works for a college and prison program now, and they're, talking about Pell support, or this person works at an advocacy organization, so it only makes sense that they do that. But when you got people from all different professions, coming to still support, it just really stood out to me. And I always made sure to, show gratitude to the network for that.
Great, thanks. So let's shift gears a little bit to the sort of nuts and bolts legislative strategy. And I know that in campaigns that I've found successful, we spend a lot of time up front seeking champions and developing champions and building support. Maybe Ben, you could address, how did we go about, what kind of champions did we have? How did we go about doing that? And what role it played in the end in a rather complicated legislative environment?
Sure. Well, I mean, we started thinking that the Higher Education Act was our vehicle, and you had Mr. Scott on the House side, and then you had Mr. Schatz on the Senate side, who, working on the REAL Act, and the House eventually did move, at least at the committee level, a version of the REAL Act, or unrestricted restoration. That was probably our first victory, and gave us an opportunity to take the next step when it became clear that the authorization bill was not likely to move. Cleverly, the campaign then started to focus on appropriations, and taking advantage of the House with its Democratic majority. We picked Rosa DeLauro from Connecticut, who was chair of the Labor HHS subcommittee, and the campaign worked with her at a grassroots level in particularly, but also on the Hill, to get the language from the education bill put into the approps bill. That language then passed the full House. That, as we said all along, that gave us a ticket to admission to whatever the end game was for the year. And we really rode that the rest of the way. On the Senate side, things were always a little more complicated, in part because you had Republicans in control of the body. And we did have a very willing legislator, Lamar Alexander, who was retiring from Tennessee, who had a wish list of education things to do. And working with several Democrats, Senator Murray, the ranking member, and others, Mr. Schatz included, we were able to leverage support for the REAL Act, or the language in the appropriations bill, essentially clean restoration of Pell access, into the Senate wish list as well. And at the end of the day, it all came together, one appropriations vehicle. The Senate brought to the table Chairman Alexander's priorities, married with restoration. The House came to the table, Chairman Scott, Rosa DeLauro, and others, with clean restoration. And in the end, they found a nice little education package that included us, and the rest is history. So a number of moving vehicles throughout the process, always require a little fluidity with the campaign, and the campaign did that, and the result speaks for itself.
So let's talk a little bit about grass tops engagement, because I think it's, the coalition was really helpful, and especially in working together in Washington. But there was a big grass tops effort as well, looking at a number of targeted states. And I think that, in my mind, that's really about getting the right people to talk to the right decision maker at the right time. Like, maybe Margaret, you could talk a little bit about how that came together and how important you thought it was, especially in getting bipartisan support.
Sure. So, as I mentioned, when we started the campaign, we were really focused on change at the state level. So we had sort of 5 states we were working in where there were active college and prison programs. We had a number of other partners at the state, and we engaged state-based lobbyists who could help us sort of navigate the politics there. When the federal opportunity, the timeline really sped up after the First Step Act passed, and when Senator Alexander announced he was going to retire. And so we decided to really focus any state strategy on the ultimate federal goal. So we were able to identify, who mattered. Mostly we're looking at Republican Senate appropriators, who mattered to them, who did they listen to, who was supportive of our issue or could become supportive, and then putting the people that they care most about in the room with them, talking about why this issue matters. And in those meetings, we were also fortunate to have a number of formerly incarcerated students talking as well. And so we had done that, and, you know, big hat tip to Leslie Kearns, who was our campaign strategist. And so we had done that pre-work. So then when it came down to crunch time at the end of last year, those relationships were in place, you know, the letters had been written. And I remember, you know, talking with you, Bill, about how you were kind of thinking about who is the one person we want to make the call now, from the grass tops up to their elected official. And it just worked. And then there were a few instances where we were also asked, the ask was actually, could your senator share support to this other person who's really vital on appropriations? So that's sort of generally how it worked. But one really standout moment was in Oklahoma, where we, through a number of different grass tops touches, Senator Langford signed on to the REAL Act. And so he became, I believe he was the second or third Republican senator to sign on. And it was very meaningful. He was, you know, sort of solidly conservative. He was from a state that is one of the top 2 highest incarcerating states in the country. And he was putting his name on Pell for All without restriction. So that was a really big moment.
So, and the victory really was a coalition effort. And, you know, Vera was, you know, a leader, and among other education, advocacy, business community, law enforcement, even some GOP governors. You know, how did that come together, that coalition?
So I'm happy to speak to it. Terrell may have additional points of view to add to this. I mean, I think there was, you know, a lot of the advocates had been working on this for a long time. And, you know, Vivian Nixon really stands out for some of the early work that she did at College Community Fellowship. But, you know, also Drug Policy Alliance, Prison Fellowship, and then there was this sort of Unlock Higher Ed coalition that came together. And then there were a bunch of groups that were not called coalitions, but included a bunch of, you know, center-right justice reform organizations, faith-based organizations, chambers of commerce, and then a couple of big businesses got on board and put their name behind this issue. So the diversity of people in support of this, you know, made it easier to argue that it was sort of a no-brainer that this needed to change. And I think the messaging that we had tested at the outset of the campaign, you know, applied in our state advocacy work and then kind of carried forward, really remained consistent throughout around the public safety argument, the return on investment argument, and really access to jobs and opportunity. And then as the national conversation around the injustice in the criminal legal system and as the Black Lives Matter movement continued to grow, I think infusing our messaging with a focus on equity, you know, we were able to do that kind of, you know, as the national dialogue was really shifting. And it, you know, those were kind of our 4 key messages throughout the last year.
Great. So that kind of leads us to the first question that I'm seeing from the chat that sort of builds on that. And we were asked by, can we speak about how we use social and earned media, and what did that look like in the campaign, and perhaps a little bit about the extent to which the messaging seeking, you know, really resonated to build broader support. And, you know, I can answer that a bit, which is to say it was very much a priority to use media and social media, particularly to reach influencers and reporters who wrote about this work, both education reporters and those that focused on criminal justice. but also earned media. And particularly we used the op-ed pages of states newspapers that whose members of the House, or we wanted to get their attention, and also senators. And one of my favorite moments in the campaign was towards the end, when we secured an op-ed piece in Senator McConnell's hometown paper that he pays attention to, right as we knew Senator McConnell was considering whether to include the education provisions in the final package of the spending bill. So that media played a role all the time, but it was really helpful in that, at that critical moment, at the right time, with the right message of an academic who was formerly incarcerated. So I don't know, Terrell, you or Margaret want to add to that?
Well, and I think just real briefly, the those of you who work on communications probably know this better than I do, but there were a lot of like needles we had to thread in terms of timing of placement of some of these pieces. So, trying to get things placed right after the election, but when things were sort of clear enough that people were reading other news again. And we were fortunate to work with 2 college presidents of HBCUs who are part of Second Chance Pell. They wrote a terrific piece that was placed in the Washington Post. And then we had 2 corrections directors co-author a piece that was placed in Politico. And they were from the states, they were from Tennessee and Washington, which mirror the Senate Help Committee chairs' home states. And so getting those 2 right, in the right time in November was also terrific.
Mm-hmm. So we have another question from the chat. Terrell was speaking to the importance of people engaging people with lived experience. And were there specific story banking techniques the campaign engaged, and what influenced the strategy for the best way to share stories on social media or with the press?
So when FICGN was conducting or participating in phone calls with staffers and other, elected officials, offices to share stories from directly impacted people, I wouldn't say that there was any like specific story banking or any like techniques. I literally would tell people to just speak from your heart, so that it's real and it doesn't come off staged or practiced or anything. And just share what education meant to you and what it would mean if people in that same prison that you essentially like left behind, those who are still incarcerated, like what that would mean to them. And I don't know why, because I knew this going into it, but still, much to my surprise, when it was the calls where we had people that were constituents of those elected officials, those stories mattered so much more. The follow-up that we received, having directly impacted people. It was a brother in Virginia that shared on the call that I was a voter for your boss. I voted for your boss to get into office, and they just them expressing like, oh, we appreciate that, and things of that nature. It really made a difference when we had people that were specifically from those districts and sharing those stories. But other than that, like, it wasn't anything that we really formed around the narrative sharing and telling their stories. It was just be honest about what it means to you and convey that to the folks on the call.
Margaret, did you want to add anything?
Oh, I think Ben just unmuted.
Oh, okay. Ben?
I was just going to say, it's really hard to convey how impactful the student stories were when they were sitting with members. They quickly weed out the lobbyists and the university folks, and they wanted to hear the stories, from the students in particular. Sometimes had some pointed personal questions, but the members were really responsive, appreciative, and supportive of the folks that came to tell their stories. And I just think it was really impactful throughout.
Mm-hmm.
I think one sort of technique that seemed effective was, because we had 2 in-person Hill days in 2019, we flew everyone in. And so they had, the teams from the states had an opportunity to meet with M&R and the comms staff and just talk about, who they were, why they were there, and just start to do some of that relationship building and story. And there was some story banking happening. And then when there were reporters from that state who were interested in covering the issue, we could reach out to those students and say, is this someone you'd be interested in being interviewed by? If not, that is totally fine. If so, do you want any coaching and that kind of thing? So I think that was a piece of strategy that was effective in terms of relationship building. So then when the reporter outreach came later, you were had that connection already.
Mm-hmm. So Margaret, the law does not go into effect until 2023. What are your priorities to help influence the implementation? Because we know that we can win policy change, but we have to make sure that the law gets actually implemented and that programs have a chance to expand. So how does Vera in particular or the community prepare for this?
Yeah, so there's 3 areas that we're focusing on initially. One is that we know corrections education directors are not really equipped to work at scale in the way that expansion could envision. And so through the brilliance of my colleague Brian Walsh, who's on the line, we launched a corrections education leadership academy to help fill that gap. Another area is we know that the demographics of students in the prison classroom are not reflective of the demographics of the people in the prison. And so that's another area that we're going to tackle head on, and Alan Walkendorfer is leading that work. And then another area, we didn't get into this in this call, but there are some really important quality provisions in the law to really, make sure that programs are in the best interest of the student. That's how the law describes it. And so one way to support quality is thinking about the role of college accreditation agencies and how they can hold up a piece of the quality for the college and prison program. So that's another area that we're working on.
Great. So this is, I think, a question for you to address, Terrell. Terrell, how can advocates and organizations engaged in this space and on this victory, we know there are endless challenges associated with policing and the justice system that especially those that disproportionately harm Black and brown people. But from a policy perspective, what would be the next fight that would hold the potential drive for dramatic change? What policy issue are you pursuing, or do you think the community should support?
So I think, wow, at the top of the list, I would say there needs to be protections against students being, blocked from opportunities based on, well, not based on, but because of policies inside the prison that disparately impact people of color. And I think a way to approach that is through like racial impact statements and seeing what we're putting in place, the criteria that we have for students to participate in this college program, such as being 2 years charge-free. If the data says that Black men in this particular facility receive charges at a much higher rate than their white counterparts, and more often than their white counterparts, then your rule that you have to be 2 years of not catching a charge, and you can catch a charge for nearly anything. Not, you can hang your towel at the foot of your bed and catch an infraction. You can have a fork in your pants while leaving like the dining hall. If you did not throw that out, that's a charge. So there's so many charges that you can catch while you're incarcerated. And if if that criteria, and that's just one example, when we talk about sentence length, when we talk about security level, you know, it's a number of things that if those policies disparately impact potential students of color, then there needs to be something put in place that before we make this a rule, we need to make sure that it's not, you know, drastically impacting students of color, people of color in the prison.
So great, thank you. So this was really a wonderful discussion, and thank you so much, Margaret, Terrell, and Ben, for giving us some of your time to join us today. And thank you to everybody on the line for participating. I have to say that working on this campaign with Vera and so many of the other allies and advocates who made this win a reality has been a highlight for me and a highlight for M&R from start to finish. I hope you found this conversation useful and that it sparks some ideas and inspiration for your own advocacy work or your organization or issues you're involved in. If you leave here remembering one thing, I hope it's that building a successful bipartisan campaign is still possible in Washington. And it takes thoughtful planning and a lot of partners, but it's still the best way to achieve lasting policy change. And that's certainly what I took away. And you'll all be receiving a link to a recording of today's discussion. Feel free to share it. And if you'd like to get in touch with any of today's participants, please reach out and we'll connect you. So thank you very much. Thanks for your time on the call today. All right. And great to be with the three of you. Bye.